We are here for the Yale launch presented by the Council on African Studies and Statecraft INC by my brilliant brothers, Chude Jideonwo and Adebola Williams. Please, can we just clap for them? The student reading comments from Darren Q, Associate Professor, Department of Conflict Resolution, will be done by me because he's not here and he is unavoidably absent. So he sent in his review. It's his copy. I did not sign it. He did. So I'd like you to pay attention while I read. Chude Jideonwo's timely and insightful new book, How to Win Elections in Africa, is brimming with enthusiasm of someone who helped the opposition in Nigeria and Ghana win two seemingly impossible victories in 2015 and 2016, filled with helpful insights on what matters to win an election and what does not matter as much as we might expect. Jideonwo speaks with authority that I can attest to as a key architect of this election upsets. Incumbent parties are difficult to defeat worldwide, but in Africa, where ruling parties often steal elections using the power of government, greased with massive corruption, with public funds stolen directly from citizens' pockets, such upsets at the ballot box are no mean feat. Chude takes us on a tour de force of the fundamental knowledge required to win a modern African election and is sure to be required reading for politicians and campaign managers across the continent. Among Jideonwo's important list of all the matters for winning elections, I'll focus on 2 points in particular to ask him to speak further. 1, you note the barrier that corruption poses for elections in Nigeria and Ghana, but frame it primarily in terms of how it fuels dissatisfaction among the electorate. How did your team try to manage or contain ruling party efforts to buy local election officials and change the vote results as they moved from each polling station to another? I will underscore Chude's point about the importance of political parties. My own work stresses what the key turning point in democratic development is the rise of a viable political opposition, since it is the only institutional actor that has a deep interest in clean elections and in rooting out government corruption, and in order to gain power. For the same reason, however, opposition parties reach out to civil society and the public to balance the power of ruling parties, which then creates obligations for these parties, one in office, which over time helps to rebuild the social contract. What prospects do you see for the PDP to rebuild itself into a viable competitor to the APC? What can it learn from the NRC in Ghana? End of Darren Q's review. Those are questions for Chude. I hope you'll be able to answer them later. At this point, I'd like to call Chude Jideonwo, the Yale Greenberg World Fellow, to come and tell us about the book, How to Win Elections in Africa. No, I think you have to sit because the panel is... Okay, just go ahead.
Good evening. It's like my birthday because I can see so many of my friends and some of my non-friends. I'm talking about you, Sam. I'm going to be reading 2 chapters from the book, chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is titled Anger Matters More Than You Know, and chapter 4 is titled Establishments Matter. Well, the book is broken into, I think, about 35 chapters, looking at all the factors that matter in elections across the continent and relating them to each other. Which matters more, which matters less, which doesn't matter at all. I start. As a confederate culture, Africans don't routinely engage with emotions on an institutional level. There is, after all, a reason why South Africa's elegant Truth and Reconciliation Commission prototype is rare still. Rwanda's brave annual contention with its genocidal history is novelty to visitors from across the continent. And Nigeria delayed the release of the Biafra movie, Half of a Yellow Sun, from its cinemas to protect the supposedly fragile sensibilities of its citizens. So it makes sense that research into our behaviors don't usually or typically measure, as the rest of the world, or at least the West, does, our emotions. Polls about Nigerians and the way they see governance routinely ignore a crucial dimension. Everyone measures the tangible, yet beneath the tangible, attitudes towards corruption, mismanagement, and insecurity lie the intangible reality that drives many reactions and perceptions of government and governance on the continent. That reality is anger. Take, for instance, the results of a May 2012 NOI Gallup poll. The poll was about corruption, but in fact, what it revealed were the emotions behind Nigerian decision-making. The results of a recent SNAP poll have revealed that incessant reports of high-profile cases of corruption, particularly the pensions fraud scandal, have made Nigerians really sad and angry, the poll noted. Respondents were asked to express how they feel whenever they hear news reports regarding the increasing cases of corruption in the country. From the results, 52% of the respondents admitted that such reports made them sad. 36% said it made them angry, and 10% said they are tired of reading about such stories, while 1% said they really do not care. It is important to note that when it comes to I don't care, as a sentiment, only 1% of the polled expressed a lack of strong emotion. That is deeply significant. Often, Nigerians will say they are tired, but this is mostly a worldly wise camouflage for the actual consistent emotion, rage. It's the same story with another poll on marriage. In response to the question of why there is increased domestic violence in the society, the NY polls reports, 6 in 10 Nigerians attribute the recent increase in domestic violence to poverty. The respondents suggested that poverty has led many people into frustration and anger, and at the slightest provocation, people resort to violence as a means of expressing frustration with their poor situation. Again, the reality is tied to an emotion, and that emotion is anger. But this is also a global reality. In April of 2016, Americans reported anger with their government as the bane of their lives. Nearly 8 in 10 Americans, 78%, said they are dissatisfied or angry with the federal government, an Associated Press JFK poll found. It's remarkable, the dichotomy between their anger and their personal lives. But at the same time, according to reports, a greater percentage of respondents said they are enthusiastic or satisfied with their personal relationships, and 77% said the same about their careers. 64% said they are happy with their financial situation. Respondents said their anger is directed at the overall political system and career politicians who they say don't put constituents first. So people are angry, but they are angry about their governments. Those findings are consistent with a presidential election that has been defined in many ways by voter anger, as anti-establishment candidates in both parties have found success by tapping into widespread frustration with Washington. The co-founder of AOL struggled with this anger in a September 2016 piece announcing his endorsement of Hillary Clinton. "I think I get why Trump has been such a potent political force this year," he said. I am well aware that millions of people are angry about their prospects and fearful that the forces of globalization and digitization have left them behind. I also recognize that many are frustrated by politics and feel we need an outsider to shake things up. But I don't think Trump is the answer for those people or for the country. His realization turned out to be too late. Nearly 7 in 10 voters said they were unhappy with the way the government was working, including a quarter who said they were downright angry. The same also happened to be true in the United Kingdom. Anger fuels the UK's Brexit campaign, read a headline in the thick of the vote debate. Growing hostility towards politicians tightens the British vote on EU membership. And then after anger at government made the UK leave the European Union, anger at government yet continues unabated. A UK Standard headline in January 27 read, "Young people express anger over Theresa May's Brexit strategy, study finds." In August 2016, The Guardian noted that anger was driving political behavior in South Africa's electoral processes. South Africans have shocked the ANC in local council elections by handing significant gains to the opposition. It said in a piece titled, "South Africa's local elections shock down to anger." But it is clear from the low turnout in crucial areas that the outcome is less about voting for the Democratic Alliance than taking a stand against the ruling party. This was the same emotion as in 2014 when NDTV reported anger as South Africans vote. In June of the same year, the Voice of America noted that South Africa's usually peaceful elections had suddenly taken a violent turn and noted the unusualness of this strong sentiment. Anger over ANC leadership drives latest cycle of violence, it said. Despite South Africa's violent history, it does not have a history of violent democratic elections. In fact, the nation was hailed for its peaceful first democratic poll in 1994. And since 2010, figures show violent protests have risen to the point where the nation sees an average of 3 protests per day. Who is angry? The poor? The desperate? No. The most angry of South Africans today, it says, is not unemployed people in the townships. The most angry people of South Africa, who also have the capacity to do something about their anger, are black middle-class South Africans. And they are angry precisely because, in their view, they have the qualifications that their parents and grandparents didn't have. They have some of the job opportunities that their grandparents and parents didn't have. And in their view, they encounter the same racial attitudes that their grandparents and parents did have. Anyone who has paid close attention to the work on the defeat of Goodluck Jonathan in 2015, John Dramani Mahama in Ghana in 2016, and the glorious disgrace of Yahya Abdulaziz Jemons Jonkong Jammeh in Gambia, also in 2016, already gets the message. The one thing voters across the world are today is angry. Without a doubt, it is the number one driver of electoral choices anywhere in the world as we speak. And that anger, fairly and squarely, is targeted at governments and politicians. It is pulling down structures, powering populists, upturning systems, and demolishing establishments. It is the most powerful tool for citizens and politicians who understand what truly matters for citizens. Let those who have ears begin to hear. The next chapter is Establishments Matter. You probably don't hear a lot about Botswana, but you should. Since its independence in 1966, it has had 4 presidents. All of them have respected the nation's constitutional term limits, handing over power peacefully right from the days of Seretse Khama. Khama handed over to Kwe Masire, who handed over to Festus Mogae, who handed over power to Khama's son Ian Khama. All of this done against the background of peace, respect for institutions, and the strengthening of the economy and polity that had begun right from its independence. Botswana, which shares a border with Zimbabwe, has for decades been mainland Africa's brightest star, a country that has gone from Dust Bowl poverty to middle-income success in a generation, Time has reported of the country, where elections are peaceful, politicians retire voluntarily, civil society is vibrant, and where natural resources, in Botswana's case diamonds, are not a curse or a spur to corruption and violent theft, but a blessing shared by all. The Encyclopedia Britannica captures the quiet dignity that has attended the administrations and retirements of Botswana's leaders through its entry on Mugabe. In other respects, Mugabe continued the policies of his predecessor and successfully steered the BDP through the 1999 elections. He made himself internationally distinctive among African leaders by acknowledging quickly the international scientific consensus surrounding the HIV/AIDS epidemic. He invited international assistance, and in a June 2001 speech before the UN General Assembly, described the epidemic as a national crisis that threatened the very survival of his people. Mugabe was viewed as a shy but principled technocrat who did not shrink from his highest responsibilities. His background at the IMF and his criticism of the repressive regime of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, however, left him open to being seen as too pro-Western. However, his work as an elder statesman and as a distinctive African leader made him the recipient of the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Achievement in African Leadership, which carried a $5 million award over 10 years. The Botswana Democratic Party, which he led, has won a clear majority of the votes every election, not by the violent suppression of dissent or the delegitimization of opposition, but by the steady maintenance of the legacy from karma to karma. It's very difficult to bring down the ruling party or to mount an opposition campaign in this kind of environment. The citizens are not uniformly pleased in Botswana, as citizens of any free country cannot be, but they are certainly satisfied with the progress and stability of their country. In essence, despite the fact of a stable establishment in this nation for 51 years, the citizens see no need to change the status quo, as they must see it, to interrupt the steady growth they have witnessed since independence. They are absolutely fine with the establishment that they have. This is, after all, the country where Masire, while he was still in office, chose to align with a movement to limit his own term in office. In 1997, constitutional amendments were approved that limited the presidency to 2 5-year terms, while lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. Mugabe explained the imperative of this selflessness in an interview. There is always the danger that if a leader stays too long in power, there is an immense psychological block among citizens who don't know whether they can be led by anybody else, resulting in trouble and confusion, he told an interviewer. Just look at the likes of Malawi's Banda or Zambia's Kaunda. They ruled for a very, very long time, and as a result, when they left, everything went seriously wrong. I am apprehensive about people who have done the right thing, like the president of Rwanda or the president of Uganda. I am apprehensive that when you rule, you reach a peak of your performance and then you begin to decline. And after a while, you begin to mistake your personal interest for the national interest, and there is a danger that you may end up betraying the very values that you held dear. It calls to mind Senegal's Macky Sall, who of his own will proposed to cut his term in office by 2 years. The 55-year-old had in 2012 defeated the incumbent, who wanted a third term in office, and then he decided to do even more. Sall said he was doing this to strengthen democracy. The constitutional reforms referendum was held in March 2016, and the constitution was changed, shortening the president's mandate from 7 to 5, approved by 62% of voters. Sall wanted the reforms to apply immediately, but in an ironic twist for Africa, voters insisted it should begin in 2019. Interestingly, the reforms included other measures to significantly weaken his own office, including constitutional recognition for the leader of the opposition, enhanced powers for local authorities, and changes to rights on land ownership and natural resources. You see, voters are not mad. They don't routinely embark on suicidal exercises to unseat establishments that act rationally and responsibly and appear to be hearkening to the voices of the people. There is an anti-establishment wave blowing across the world, yes, but there are nations, democratic, free nations, where this wind cannot take root because the existing establishments work for the people. So here is the crux. Establishments matter. If they act with humility and efficiency, citizens maintain them as the vehicles for ongoing change. If they act with arrogance and insularity, citizens send them packing and replace them with alternatives. As some of you know too well, sometimes any alternative. Citizens are not crazy. They understand clearly the imperatives of democracy. They know that power corrupts, and they get that democracies in their essence entrench power structures when people win elections. They know essentially that establishments are a byproduct of democracies. Establishments are, of course, formal and informal custodians of power across crucial levels of society, working together to maintain what its leading lights consider the needed stabilities of that society. Democracy is therefore the process of changing this balance and the composition of this establishment from time to time in order to maintain a useful equilibrium of performance and accountability. Citizens know this. They know that when they go out to vote and vote out an existing group of power brokers, they are replacing an old establishment with a new establishment. The question is, what kind of establishment do they have? And what kind of establishment do they want? People who want power, for whatever reasons, have to have an understanding of the delicate balance between leader and led, between politician and voter in a functioning democracy. It's a ceding of power and control by a mass of people to a very small group. It's the handover of the boundaries that govern existence. In return, the people, the voter, expect a posture of humility and deference, one that continues to locate legitimacy and authority in popularity. There are those who accuse politicians of pandering. I am not one of them. Pandering is essential to democracy. A representative sent by constituents to a legislature is not there of his or her own accord to join an elite club that prizes its own committee and relationships above the needs of the voter. The politician isn't there as a free moral agent. She is there as a conduit for the desires and imperatives of the voting public. The moment she begins to lose sight of that fact, the balance of power has tilted unnaturally, and she has ceased to be an asset to the voter. When a collection of public officials act in this way, they have become an establishment that has gone astray. In any functional democracy, citizens begin to harbor resentments against this set of leaders. Continuous resentment towards the crop ultimately leads to a movement of anger. Movements of anger, well channeled, lead to movements like Occupy Nigeria or Brexit. Usually, establishments that have failed are unprepared, which is natural. If they were prepared, the circumstances would not have arisen for their removal in the first place. Leaders who are effective know how to connect with their voters in a sustained way, creating a feedback loop that modifies behavior or produces outcomes that make leader and led happy. The key to maintaining this balance is humility. The humility of the elected to understand the source of its own power and to keep that source happy. This humility is also the humility to explain yourself. The humility to understand that your role is not to demand understanding of the voter or take for granted the frame of engagement, but to steadily ensure that both voter and voted are on the same page. The burden to create and maintain that frame lies on the person contracted to do a job, and that person is the public office holder. In the light of Brexit or Donald Trump, many have taken to the newspaper, to television, or to social media, decrying essentially the stupidity of the voting public. Doing that shows a misunderstanding of the power dynamic. If establishments have lost credibility with the electorate, and with it the power to convince, that is on them and not on the electorate. Citizens are busy with everyday living, making ends meet and making societies run efficiently. In doing that, they outsource decision-making, consensus building, and action engineering to their leaders and to their elected and appointed leaders. To take them out of their daily lives and get them to commit to a course of action or a set of imperatives, the politician must understand what drives them, must connect with the issues that matter to them, and must empathize with the evolution of their worldviews, actions, and decisions. Any politician who is not so deeply connected with the citizen does not deserve to be rewarded with election or re-election. Any system that does not maintain this connection is malfunctioning and deserves to be replaced. So establishments are not really the problem. They are inevitable. And in many cases, everywhere from the UAE to Australia, they can be useful organs for social cohesion and financial prosperity. Disconnected, self-involved establishments are the problem. Those that forget the source of their power, legitimacy, and imperative. Wherever they emerge, citizens have the right and the duty to punish them. Sometimes, in punishing them, they overreact and they overcorrect. But in all these examples, the essential right to punish a recalcitrant establishment must be inalienable. If the establishments don't like it, then they need to start behaving themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chude. I've been across the continent myself to observe elections from countries like Zimbabwe, not for elections this time around, just visiting for work, to Ghana and to Rwanda. I agree with you that establishment does matter. You go to countries like Zimbabwe where Zimbabweans are asking, Mercy, how does it feel to be Nigerian? How does it feel to vote out someone? You know, and you look into their eyes and you can see that they really need change, but they're just stranded. Mm-hmm. Then you go to Rwanda where, yeah, you know, we all have our reservations about Paul Kagame's style, but there's still sort of development. You can look around and say, establishment does matter. Continuity does matter at some point. Then you go to Ghana, where they say, you know what, if he's not doing well, we're just going to kick him out at the end of the 4-year term. So, yeah, thank you, Chude, for that presentation. So at this point, I think I wouldn't want to bore you with my stories about traveling Africa. I'd like to call Michel Capello. He's the chair, Council on African Studies. He is the panel moderator. Oh, he is introducing the panel. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Thank you. Do you have? Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
So thank you very much and welcome everyone. Chude, it's great for us to be part of this. My name is Michael Capello. I'm a professor in the medical school across campus here, and I'm also chair of the Council on African Studies, and I co-direct the El Africa initiative here. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our panelists today. We begin, I guess, perhaps as I introduce each of you, maybe you'll sort of take a seat so everyone will know to whom I'm referring. We'll begin with Lorna Solis. So Ms. Solis is the founder and CEO of Blue Rose Compass, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to giving young refugees the opportunity to become agents of change in the world. Blue Rose Compass travels to conflict zones around the world, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and East Asia to identify talented young adults and to help them achieve their educational and professional goals. She has extensive experience also in the private sector, in the fields of investment and consulting, and she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Next up, Professor Seekings. So Jeremy Seekings is director of the Center for Social Science Research at the University of Cape Town, and also interim director of the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship, and Public Policy in Africa. His research focuses on society and politics in East and Southern Africa, including quantitative and qualitative studies of social stratification, the transformation of kinship and families, and the history and contemporary politics of poverty reduction and welfare state building. Professor Seekings is also currently a visiting scholar and professor here at the Council on African Studies at the Macmillan Center at Yale. Next up, Casey King. He directs the Capstone program and is a lecturer at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs just up the street on Hill House here at Yale. He teaches courses on big data and global policies, as well as anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing and anti-human trafficking. Dr. King's research focuses on the nexus of national security and technology, and he has a number of projects on big data, projects on combating radicalism and social media and financial warfare. He's consulted for a number of federal government agencies, including Homeland Security, Treasury, the FBI, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and he's also the author of a book on the history of ambition. Next up is Eddie Mandry. Here's Eddie. So Eddie's the director for Africa in the Yale Office of International Affairs, where he works with faculty to develop partnerships between Yale and African institutions in the private and public sectors. He supports admissions recruitment. He also helps to build Yale's alumni networks and expand its press and social media presence on the continent. Previously, Eddie was Associate Director of NYU Africa House. He's a Carnegie New Leader, and he also serves on the Board of Trustees of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Last but not least, we have Chris Beatty. Mr. Beatty is Managing Director of KRL International, the consulting firm. He has experience working in post-conflict and post-disaster environments and has played an advisory role in several peaceful democratic transitions. He supports clients in designing market entry strategies and also programs to manage political risk. And he's advised clients on matters related to government advocacy, political positioning, and communications. Most relevant, I think, to today's discussion, Mr. Beatty served as a strategic advisor on a number of political campaigns, including the re-election in 2011 of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, and also the recent election of Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo in Ghana. He continues to serve as an advisor to both of those governments. So I think this is going to be a very interesting panel. Our moderator, if you could. Here we go. Where are we here?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So we want to thank, obviously, the whole audience for being here today. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us, and obviously, a big congratulations to Chude on the new book. So this is a particularly exciting panel for me to moderate, just because I'm a recent Yale College graduate, and my thesis was on African elections and ethnicity. So bear with me if I seem a little bit overexcited to be here today, but hopefully we'll have some interesting discussion. So I just kind of want to start by, I think that each of you does very uniquely different things related to democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. And so maybe just give everybody in the audience a sense of sort of where you personally feel democracy in sub-Sahara is today. I think there's a lot of debate and contradiction about, is it in a positive place, is it in a negative place, has it progressed, has it regressed, whatever those impressions you might be.
That is a huge question.
Yeah, didn't start easy.
And the continent is enormous. But I thought we were going to focus on Rwanda and Kenya primarily, right? Oh. Yeah, I mean, of course it's complex. And I can't, without diving into the details, like the case of Rwanda, well, we're going to dive into it later. But I think some countries are regressing. I think some countries are progressing, like anywhere else in the world, by the way, not just the continent of Africa. And it is complex. Very different what's happening in Kenya than Rwanda. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, and it's only been since the 70s that we've had independence in the majority of Africa, so it hasn't been that long. So I think that there's still a lot of room to grow. I'll stop there because I know we're going to dive in.
This is always a sort of half full or half empty question. I I'm by origin British, and I first started having an active interest in research in Africa in the 1980s. And it's worth reminding ourselves of how different Africa is today than Africa in the 1980s. When I first travelled and did research in Africa, in East and Southern Africa, you were travelling from one party regime to another. Some of those regimes were superficially benign, for example, Nyerere regime in Tanzania, and some of them were far from benign. For example, the Moi regime in Kenya, arguably the Kaunda regime in Zambia, and then of course in Southern Africa the settler states. So the East and Southern Africa, West Africa have changed enormously over what is actually, in world historical terms, quite a short time period, right? And I think where we're at now, my sense of where we're at now, is that we're beginning to recognise that actually things have changed quite a lot, but we certainly shouldn't be carried away with naive sort of romantic optimism, because we can see that, as Chude has said, it's difficult to throw out incumbents. Incumbents have many advantages. The playing field is very rarely level. Elections are often not free and fair. Even in somewhere like Botswana, which deservedly Chude has drawn attention to, even in Botswana, elections are arguably not entirely free and fair. So the playing field is not level, and there are cases, very clearly there are cases of where we should be growing increasingly concerned. In Southern Africa, I have a particular interest in Zambia. We have some Zambians in the audience. Many Zambians are really are very disillusioned with direction of change in Zambia as an example of a country which appeared to be democratizing in an extremely encouraging direction. And then in the last 3 or 4 years, we can see that the shift is really very worryingly in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think Chude makes this point very clearly in the last chapter of his book, which I think is wonderful, not only for elections on the continent, but elections everywhere, because it's so conceptual. It speaks to very human impulses. So it was a great pleasure for me to read. Chude makes a point that citizens understand the power of democracy. And I'm wondering how we reconcile that assertion with the growing insurgencies, particularly in northern Nigeria, Lake Chad Basin, Cameroon, Niger, where we're seeing that, and it's being asserted that participation in democracy constitutes or is cause for execution. And we look at Boko Haram, we look at ISIS West Africa, we look at anyone who actually flees the caliphate. Shekau is prepared to execute just for fleeing the caliphate, even if they don't participate with the Nigerian government in oppressing Boko Haram. So I think citizens, as you say in your introductory remarks in the chapter that you read, citizens do understand the power of democracy, but increasingly, in some of the areas that I'm studying, I'm teaching a course at the U.S. State Department on Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa messaging and counter-messaging. Looking at the messages, it seems as though there's, and in another chapter you say narratives matter. They're positing a narrative that democracy is haram. And how do we reconcile this, and how do we address this very potentially destructive impulse? Or let's not make it pejorative. Competing narrative, is that better?
I think that there is a very mixed picture in terms of the landscape around the continent with regard to how democracies are maturing or how democratic practice is taking root. But there are also, examples of countries where heads of state still clinging on to power for decades. Strikingly, Dos Santos left power in Angola. I was quite surprised to see that happen, but maybe because they'd already amassed so much wealth in his family, there's no more to tap from the resources of the nation. No offense to any friends of the Angolan government. But Teodoro Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, 37 years in power, Museveni, 30 years. So the list goes on. There's still bastions of autocracy that are still standing, and it goes very much contrary to the demographic dynamics around the continent. And I'm sure we'll get to that in this conversation. So it's a mixed picture in my sense.
I'm pretty excited to get the mic last on this question, so thank you for that. As everyone noted, I think every country is unique, and a unique electorate, unique election rules. But in terms of overall trends on the continent, I have some of the same concerns that I do in the U.S. or in Europe. Those being campaign finance issues, those being state use of resources to support ruling parties. I think these issues need to be delved into deeper. I hope we get to discuss some of them today. But from my perspective as someone who I've worked on 5 different presidential campaigns, African presidential campaigns over the last 10 years, I'm more optimistic. I'm very excited about what the new media landscape means and social media means on the continent, because we're seeing electorates connect in a way that's breaking down traditional barriers. Traditionally, people have been grouped, rightly or wrongly, by region or ethnicity or religion, and now we're seeing new ways in which voters are connecting on a basis of ideas. Now that's the hope, that's the optimism. The downside of that, of course, was previously mentioned. It creates an echo chamber for certain ideas that are destructive. But overall, I think that if that power can be harnessed in a positive way, it presents a whole new realm of possibilities for democracy on the continent.
So just to sort of, I think, jump right into what Lorna was pointing out, which is, the title of the panel today is Calm in Rwanda and Chaos in Kenya, right? And I think that anyone who pays attention would argue that there's a lot of controversial things to unpack in that statement, because to choose to distinguish calm in Kenya and chaos in, calm in Rwanda and chaos in Kenya would be to base that assumption on what we're here to talk about today, which is elections. And so I'm interested to hear what you think about the positives and dangers of defining democracy, particularly in those places, by the electoral process, and whether things like violence are being inaccurately used to characterize the positivity or negativity of those elections. Because someone might argue, for example, that the chaos in Kenya, the Supreme Court's decisions all represent the democratic system best at work, versus the calm in Rwanda simply indicating a lack of interest on the part of the citizenry. So whoever would like to take that first.
Yeah, Rwanda, very interesting, and I've had the pleasure of meeting President Kagame several times. And I used to work for Institutional Investor, by the way, so I covered sub-Saharan Africa for 16 years for this publication, and I traveled extensively throughout the continent and fell in love with it. I'm Nicaraguan, and I can say that in Africa, I was so pleased. They all knew what Nicaragua was, but of course they were like, oh yeah, Ortega. I'm like, wrong guy, but yes, Ortega. And they knew where it was, and I was very surprised, because I have to say in America, they thought Nicaragua was in Africa. So anyhow, that happened a lot. Really a beautiful country that I embrace and embraced me. Rwanda is very interesting. As much as I want to believe that democracy is what we have in the West, who are we to say what should be happening in Rwanda? The one thing I fault President Kagame on is not having people that can succeed him. I mean, he's been in power for long enough where I think there should be others that could potentially take over. But from what my understanding is in Rwanda, with the majority of Hutus outside in Congo and Burundi, and he's clearly trying to make sure the ones in Congo don't come back to Rwanda, is to prevent yet another potential genocide that could be twice as big as the last one, seeing that Tutsis have the minority. So I think and the people did ask him to stay. That is also clear. So again, who are we in the West to say you have to do the same, it has to look the same as a democracy as we have in the US or outside? I can't even say we have a democracy right now with this guy's president, but anyhow, that's another conversation. So I understand why he has stayed on. What I hope to see is that there are people that can succeed him. God forbid he gets hit by a bus tomorrow. Seriously, like what's going to happen? So these are, I hope, concerns and things that I'm sure he's thinking of. The case in Kenya, it is a two-party state, unlike Rwanda, which is becoming a one-party state. In Kenya, I exasperate. I have so many friends that are in the government there, and I have friends that are outside. And the last 2 days, I actually made a lot of calls to different people, and my God, did I get different opinions. The way I see it is, Uhuru, Chatham House, no one's recording this, right? Chatham House rules. I feel like Uhuru is clinging on to power. He's clinging on as much as he can. And even though finally the Constitution after 20 years was changed to allow these sorts of irregularities to come forward, now Parliament has changed and created this law where it completely just threw all that out the window. 20 years of hard work. So I understand why Raila doesn't want to have the other election, which 60 days for that window was just too small to change all the systems so that you could have a proper elections, right? So the irregularities were in the electronic system. So if you don't change that, what's the point? That you're going to have the same outcome. So I think for Kenya, I don't think there's going to be unrest. I think people, from what I hear from my friends in Kenya, is that they're tired. They just need to feed their families and go on with business. And so I don't think there's going to be an unrest in Kenya. I hope I'm right. I think Kenya's seen enough. But unfortunately, this means that Kikuyus will continue in power. And to me, it's become a bit of a tribal system where you just vote for the tribe. And so how can you have democracy when you don't have ethnic cohesion? How do you have both? I don't know. So I think that's what we're seeing in Kenya, and not just Kenya, other places, but I know we're discussing those two. Anyhow, I'll stop there.
I haven't spent much time in either Rwanda or Kenya recently, but my sense is, let me say something about Kenya. My sense of Kenya is that Kenya is a very good example of Chude's comments about anger. I've always been impressed by how angry Kenyans have been for a very long time, right? Regardless of who's in power. I mean, in East and Southern Africa, I think I'd hazard to guess. I've never looked at opinion poll data, if there is any, on anger, but I'm pretty confident if there was data that Kenyan voters would have been angrier than voters in most other parts of East and Southern Africa for quite a long time. Even when their government is their party is in government, that anger is chronic, because there is very real discontent with the way in which elites in both parties have treated the state as a resource to be plundered. That said. The Kenyan case does raise some very, I think, important general issues, which is what do opposition parties do when they're faced with a playing field that isn't level? Now, this isn't a position in Rwanda, because in Rwanda there isn't a playing field. I mean, the Kagame government might be doing lots of things which we approve of, but I don't think one can say it's a level, there's no democratic playing field. We're on a different playing field. But Kenya is a superficially democratic playing field, but it's clearly not free and fair. And what do opposition parties do? Now, I don't have any great inside knowledge of thinking within Kenya's opposition parties, but as a general rule, I think opposition parties across much of Africa have been, for some time, often quite naive about winning elections. I'm very interested to hear what Chris has to say. And I think this is why Chude's book is really important. I I mean, Chude's book is really important because actually opposition parties have not been very good at fighting elections for the most part. Sometimes they've won, often by accident, more than through strategic wisdom and design. Right, that's my impression, and I know very little about the West African cases. So what do you do if you're an opposition party and you're faced with a playing field that's not level? Now, one option is the boycott. And I think that under certain circumstances, one has to take the boycott strategy very seriously. I mean, in the end, in Zimbabwe, in 2008-9, the opposition eventually kind of boycotted the second round of presidential elections, which allowed Mugabe to be re-elected when he clearly wouldn't have been re-elected in a free and fair vote. And they probably didn't have any choice in the matter. Did the opposition in Odinga have a choice about boycotting the elections in Kenya? Tough call, I think, boycotting elections. But we have to take it seriously. I think it's a tactic one has to take seriously because participating in a playing field that's not level is clearly it's not really a sustainable strategy. The Zimbabwean example is a good one. So I think that sometimes if you're an opposition party, you actually have to go for the showdown. You have to say, we're not going to legitimate this process, and if the process doesn't change, then we're going to stand outside. And I would hope that in the Kenyan case, as in Zimbabwe in 2009, that there'll be enough pressure, as there has been in Kenya before, on the government that it won't be able to ignore if it eventually gets a poll and returns it unopposed, that it won't be able to ignore that.
Yeah, I'd like to cede to Chris because I feel like I'm between Beyonce and Jay-Z here, and I'm singing karaoke. So, Chris?
Am I Jay-Z in this scenario? This is not, okay. Well, I think that's a really, really important point, and being an opposition party is very, very difficult these days. And generally speaking, I have some concerns in recent years because some opposition parties, and I'm not attributing this to the current situation in Kenya specifically, but some opposition parties, when they either go into a second round or go into an election that they feel they cannot win, the strategy that's emerged is, and it is an active strategy, is to undermine the process. It is to, not necessarily just through boycott, but to stir up some violence or to manufacture some situations at polling stations and then say, oh, it's contested, we need a transitional arrangement, and then we can negotiate. Specifically, the example in Ghana is worth noting because if that was President Akufo-Addo's first election, he does not win. It was his third go-around, and because it was his third go-around, his campaign was so well developed, and it was well developed well before I got there, so that I'm not praising anything that I did or the authors of this book did. So I worked with President Akufo-Addo and his campaign in 2008, not on his 2012 campaign, and then again for this most recent one. And what we learned in that time was it's not just about winning at the polls. It's about tracking the voter registration. It begins years in advance. And making sure that you register your voters, making sure that they turn out, making sure that you track the vote, and making sure that you have that written proof. And in Ghana, what that proof is, it's called a pink sheet. At every polling station, there were 29,000 polling stations. At every polling station, they give you, or the parties, the party poll watchers, a carbon copy of the sheet. In 2012, the campaign was very confident they had won, and they were very confident it had been stolen. They went to the Supreme Court. They didn't have those pink sheets. They couldn't prove it. So between the period of 2012 and 2016, they set up a very elaborate system to copy, scan, track every single pink sheet. Now, this also resulted, and I apologize, I'll wrap it up as quickly as I can, but this also resulted in a difficult decision we had to make because as we were getting those pink sheets in, and the campaign team did such a phenomenal job of doing that on a very short timetable, we began to get reports that not at polling stations, but at the regional coalition centers where our party poll watchers couldn't go, that there was the high potential for manipulation. So we are worried that the Electoral Commission is going to announce numbers that we don't agree with, and the discussion gets heated, and we don't know exactly what we'll do if that happens. But we had all these pink sheets, and we made the determination that when we reached 80% of the pink sheets from the polling stations that are signed by the election officials, that we would make them public. And I still struggle with that decision, because it is a political party coming out to essentially announce results, even if they're signed by election officials, even if they are the official documents. It creates a dangerous precedent that I'm not wild about. And that's something that will need to be wrestled with going forward. And in the most recent elections in Liberia, there were reports that some of the political parties were going to announce their own results, and I know those campaigns did not have very elaborate systems to collect those results in the same way. But as an opposition party, I think, and back to your original point, it begins well before Election Day. And what worries me about Kenya is the objections over the electoral officials, the objections over the voter registration, all of that was pushed well into a period of a constitutional crisis because they weren't allowed the time to adjudicate those issues. And I don't know if their strategy is to drag those issues out over time and cause a constitutional crisis or not, or even if it's their fault, because another thing we saw in Ghana was there were a lot of issues with the voter roll, but everybody assumed it was just an opposition party that was whining. And there was no third-party referee that could say, oh, these are legitimate, we need to look into these. So I realize none of that provides any answers. It merely observes more of the problems. But I think it's really important that opposition parties build those systems, invest in strong teams and technology years in advance, and pay attention to the process, and have legal teams that know the Constitution in and out, that know when you need to register your poll watchers, all that stuff. This is a multi-year thing, and I worry that international observers and things that show up a month or 3 weeks before are missing the whole ballgame. By the time they get there, it could be over.
As a Kenyan on the panel, what's been really interesting following the elections and the the court proceedings and the poll that they had again most recently, the repeat poll, is something that was said earlier. There's a level of frustration within the Kenyan public with the process. There's campaign fatigue. We're tired of the same leaders giving us the same political rhetoric and not necessarily translating that into development plans and agendas that are implemented by them. And so you juxtapose that with what we have in Rwanda, where is it a democratic system? But what is Kagame able to deliver in terms of delivery of service, the delivery of infrastructure, power, access to education, health? He's hitting all those targets. And so when he has 94% approval in the election, and everyone outside is screaming, Human Rights Watch, there's no free press, there's no opposition, what's going on in Rwanda, it's an autocratic system. But then Rwandans in the diaspora are also voting at the same percentage points. They're not censored. They live in free societies. So you wonder, which narrative has utility and value in trying to understand how democracy and the growing pains of democracy are playing out on the continent.
Can I pose, I think, an extended question based on that I think would be interesting, is if we're thinking, therefore, I think everybody's answer had some sort of reference to citizenry and the sort of conversations about anger and like who is contributing, and you even raised earlier about social media. So I think maybe it's a personal thing, but at the nexus of all of these things and people are the youth. And I mean, data is showing that almost 50% of the African continent is under the voting age, which means that over the next decade, the very fabric of who is voting, who can vote, and who is thinking even fundamentally about the concept of elections will be very different. And so starting sort of with running the capstone program and thinking about global affairs, but also I think in all the work that you do where you interact with questions of citizenry, where does the youth fit into this conversation? Are they simply the angry voices that are pushing this concept of like challenging establishment? Are they the potential for building leadership capacity? And who should we be building? I think is a particularly engaging question when you consider how many Africans who are studying abroad are in this room, and who the primary conversation about youth empowerment should be about. Should it be about, can it be about diasporic students? Can it be about students who are studying abroad, and does that mean they have to return home? Should it be about the youth on the continent today who are discussing and asking questions and challenging politics in their countries? I mean, especially if, for example, conversations about, say, Rwanda, even the youth are voting at equally high levels. And I mean, the case in which they talked about the legal status of allowing him to run a third time was actually put forward by university students, or came out of conversations that the youth were having. And so clearly it's not quite clear cut as to where even the new population or rising population of people should be sitting. And I think based on what you all do, it'd be interesting to think about how you think that nexus is working. So I don't know if Casey would like to start.
I'm going to defer to Lorna. No, just kidding. I think youth matters, and obviously Eddie Okech, who was here at Jackson, organized some 300,000 youth. But I think it's back to this notion of what Jeremy mentioned and Lorna referred to as well, which was these tribal affiliation. How can we encourage youth to think beyond sort of these identity politics and connect to either larger ideas, concepts of nation state, concepts of hope, as Chude refers to in his book, Hope Matters. We've seen in the United States this attachment to this idea of hope created a consolidated voting public who supported a particular candidate. But I do think that we talk about people vote for their tribe. And in the States, we see identity politics. So, I mean, my question to my fellow panel members and to Chude as well is how do we harness this energy, this hope, and these great expectations such that it's possible to transcend this particularities of a specific tribe or ethnic affiliation? And I don't know the answer. Yeah, sure.
What's taking shape in terms of rural to urban migration, there's larger concentrations of young people from across different backgrounds, tribes, having to live together in clusters or communities where, just as a matter of survival, they have to set aside their tribal differences to some degree. And I think that trend across the continent is creating more commonality and interest between people of different tribes who are young and use kind of various methods to survive in a system where social safety nets don't function as they should, but they're interacting with each other, and so that's I think I see some of that changing in kind of the urban dynamics. And populations moving to the cities. And then we have a situation in Rwanda where, as a government policy, tribe is something that you just don't talk about. You don't identify yourself as Hutu or Tutsi, you're Rwandan first. So in terms of the national identity being the fundamental way that people interact, navigate through life, and that is from the top down, bottom up, every which way. So it's interesting to talk about, maybe what implications does that have in terms of the makeup of the society, their culture, their history, if this new way of looking at what it means to be Rwandan is centered on your identity as a citizen of the nation.
Do you think that having an autocrat actually helps address those identity issues? I mean, I know that's a somewhat unpopular position, but I mean, we've seen in Rwanda, if these statistics are in fact correct, that it seems to be helpful, it seems to be working.
In Rwanda, given the history of the country, the unique history, the genocide, I think the size of the nation, it's a very small country, not a very large population. So just contextually speaking, it seems to have worked there. But I just don't know, in a place like Nigeria or in DRC where the numbers are much larger, the societies are far more complex, it could be a bit difficult to have, whether you have an autocratic leader or not, might not result in the same outcome.
I don't know if you want to speak. I know you mentioned a little bit about social media and sort of where you think that might fit in, and also the work you do with, supporting, students who are refugees and sort of bringing them out of their backgrounds into this education space as well. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that before we start to shut down. I'm getting signs.
Sure. No, I think, as I said before, I think the role of social media and social networks is an exciting one because it allows people to connect in a way that transcends tribe or region or religion or ethnicity. And I think it presents a lot of potential opportunities to develop the next class of leaders on the continent. But I also think in terms of, as Lorna mentioned earlier, a good gauge of political leadership is those leaders' ability to build that next generation and take over from them. And obviously that hasn't happened in Rwanda. And from my perspective, from someone who works on campaigns, from a campaign perspective, I've seen people try and target the youth, I've seen people try to appeal to the youth, but I haven't yet seen a government successfully integrate the youth into their government and into those high-level positions where they can slowly take over and hand the torch off. I worry that the elder class tends to linger a little bit too long, so whoever can successfully integrate the next generation of African leaders, I feel like will be a ruling party for a very long time.
Yeah, just to add, so absolutely with social media, and I mean, let's look at the Arab Springs, right? I mean, this was all from social media, from Twitter, basically. And in Kenya, as we know, I just heard Bob Collymore is now out of Safaricom, because now we saw that Safaricom was actually rigging their system to help Uhuru. So he's out, which is terrible. I was supposed to see him this weekend in Dubai. He's part of the Global Future Council with me at the World Economic Forum. He's in my council, and I just found out he's not there because of this. So I was quite shocked. Shocked and not shocked. But again, with youth, I believe that with social media and Twitter and all these incredible technologies coming about, they will have a stronger voice than ever. And with that said, as long as corruption is rampant in the governments, then it's going to be a very challenging uphill battle for the youth to have a voice. Whose government is incredibly corrupt, but I think with Odinga's, it would have the same. It's just different people, different names, but the same situation. I'm from Nicaragua. Trust me, we have a guy who's going to be there till he dies, and his wife's going to take over. She's the vice. It's a disaster. So I understand these things, but the youth absolutely has a strong voice. Nigeria, 11 million kids not in school, all fleeing from the north, from Boko Haram, from Kano, Kaduna. And I've taken 30 girls, 30 Chibok girls are my students. And they're all in the US, Germany, and the UK. Of the first, 50 that were taken, the first that were taken out. So we work, so my nonprofit, since you brought up my nonprofit, we work primarily, we started with Africa. I started with Kenya in Dadaab refugee camp. The first kid I took out, Somali refugee, had been there 13 years. He'd fled Somalia, and I sent him to Princeton. Long story, no way there's time for me to get into the details, but he went to Princeton, then he went to European Business School in Germany, graduated with a master's in finance. He works at JP Morgan today. Abbas was in a camp with no running water and no electricity 8 years ago. He's at the risk, he's the number 2 in the risk department at JP Morgan, making 6 figures. He's taken his entire family out at the Dadaab, and they're all with him now, safe. But imagine the struggle of him being in Princeton and knowing I'm eating and I'm sleeping in a bed, and my family is in the Dadaab refugee camp sleeping every night. And after him, I took 6 more, and that's when I decided to leave my finance job of my career of 16 years and do this full time. So we work in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, and now, unbelievable, Latin America. I have Venezuelans coming into my program, Yemenis, that breaks my heart, Rohingyas. It's a never-ending chaotic situation that these so-called leaders that are failing us, and it's a lot to do with corruption. So again, the corruption bit, if it's at the top, how can you even get youth to do anything when the corruption is predominant? So So I feel for these fragile states who have these broken systems. I mean, look at the U.S. We don't have to go very far. I mean, look what's happened here. We just have to go to D.C. to see what's happening in our own country. So I believe that youth is the answer. I love what you just said about that youth in Rwanda is more like, you don't talk about the tribe. You know, it's Rwandans first. I don't know when we'll see that in Kenya. It's so ingrained, or like in South Africa where it's Zulu, or I mean, it's so ingrained. It's going to take a long time. But that's where, and I'm the forever optimist, or else I could not do the job I do. Trust me. I have hope that these next generations will be able to have that cohesion. It's what I said. Without ethnic cohesion, you cannot have democracy. And I think that's why it's working in Rwanda. I understand that he could stay there for a long time. But you know what? They want him. They voted for him. I just wish he has successors coming up. That would be my only wish for Rwanda.
I've been getting signs that I should call time. But I will say, just sort of from listening, and thank you, all of you, for joining us today, that I do think that it gets back to this conversation about hope and thinking about hope within establishments. And how do we turn what is an emotion to a lot of people into policy making, into structures that for the generation that is going to inherit that political system will mean something and can be used to make the kind of meaningful change that you have all identified clearly needs to be made across sub-Saharan, democracies, wherever they may be currently. So I just want to thank you all again. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Yeah, that was a brilliant panel. I loved it from the first introduction to where it ended. But I think my own takeout note is the power of social media and what it has become. And we should not ignore it for the continent. I mean, all over the continent, wherever they are having elections, governments are trying to shut down the internet. That's an indication of the power of the internet. And it has offered people the freedom to say what they want to say. There's been massive crackdown of social media users across the continent. It shows us the power that platform has been able to offer young people and the millennials. So yeah, it's a change platform, and I am also very optimistic that we are all going to take advantage of the opportunity it gives us to say things that ordinarily gatekeepers like Yinka Adegoke 300 years ago would have doctored, but that's not going to happen. I'd like to call Yinka to take over the next session with Chude Jideonwo.
We have mics.
So yeah, it's pretty much it. A question and answer process. What's your other mic? Does it need a mic? The other one is fine, thank you.
Right. My name is Yinka Adegoke. I am the Africa editor for Ports. Ports is a digital platform which covers business and economics primarily, and obviously politics is incredibly important in the time we are, but it's always really important in Africa. It influences everything. Nothing works in our countries without politics and governments. And I am excited to talk to Chude about this new book, which unfortunately not working. Right. I just have a loud voice. So. Sorry. Thank you. Unfortunately, I didn't, because we missed each other, I didn't get the book in early enough, but I'm about halfway through and enjoying it very much. Congratulations. So I just thought this, rather than get all formal and, you had the really smart panelists up here, I'm not that guy. I'm just a journalist, and I okay. But I did want to just sort of just throw a few things at you some of them you touched in the book, some of them we've just heard on the panel. the one, because the first time I heard about your work and Deborah was, the 2011 elections in Nigeria, and it was, it was framed as working on the youth, sort of looking at the youth vote. And as, I can't remember who said it just now on the panel, the thing about, when you talk about youth vote in Africa, that's essentially the vote, right? Because, all our countries are so young. So when people, if someone hires you or your company or, as a consultant to help with the youth vote, what are the first things that you're, let's assume it's a country you haven't been in, let's assume it's not Nigeria. Yeah. What are the first things that you investigate and approach and ask, the first few questions you ask?
Right. I don't know why Deborah doesn't want to do this, because everyone should be the one answering the type of question. Because all I do is read the report.
He just likes to wear a nice background.
But the first things we do, and there's a chapter in the book called Narratives Matter. Right. And the first thing we do, also because, resources are limited, in many African elections, especially for the things, people are learning to move monies away from moving ballot boxes to investing in persuasion. Yeah, so sometimes it's very difficult to give them.
It's a totally different change.
Yeah, to make a business case for investing in monitoring paper slips. And so sometimes you're having to make decisions about, okay, what's the best way to map this out? And usually what we end up doing is, because most of what we focus on is communication and the media, is to map out the narratives. What are the stories that young people are telling themselves about their country? Yes. What are the stories they're telling themselves about their leaders? And what are the stories that they are being told about their country? So it's really, we're monitoring the clash of the stories, essentially. Because, and I think there's a chapter about facts. After the American elections, for instance, there's a conversation globally about how much, so should we beat people with the facts on their head? And we found that that's not really what happens. Facts can be there, but the fact can be stubbornly ignored. What's more important is the story that people are telling themselves from the facts, or the stories people are telling themselves in spite of the facts. And it's those stories that people use when they go to the polling booths. It's those stories that determine how they... old man versus young. So sometimes the story is as simple as, oh, he's an old man, we're not voting an old man. The story is as simple as, we're not voting an Hausa man, we're voting an Hausa man. The story is as simple as so there's stories. And so what we first do is to map out what are the stories that the voters are hearing, and what are the stories that are breaking through to the voters. So it's one thing for politicians to keep saying something, and it's another thing for the voter to internalize enough to act on that story. Yeah.
And then I wanted to, this is a flip side of the same coin, which is something that Mercy just said just then. Really, this is something we obsess a lot about at Quartz, which is the impact of technology and the internet, especially social media, but particularly this idea of internet shutdowns and the real concern. I think last year there were 11 countries in Africa shut down the internet. That's usually around election time or some sort of major event. So clearly this, just like what Mercy just said, clearly the internet and platforms like WhatsApp in particular have a real kind of influence on the conversations that people are having and organizing. And so is this, when you're trying to reach out to youth, is this something that you guys focus on, using these platforms, or do you go more, or is that overplayed? I'm kind of interested because you actually...
So there are two chapters in the book, one that deals with technology and one that deals with social media. And we had to remove social media from technology because often people confuse the two in dealing with elections. And social media has to be treated as a form of media, essentially, not necessarily as a technology tool. And the verdict is that, one, we don't have the data to make really informed, evidence-based conclusions about the impact that technology has had. But when it comes to narrative is exaggerated. Now that's weird because as a young person in the digital age, as a millennial and etc., I'm constantly under pressure from international media, to talk up the power of the internet. But unfortunately, when I'm doing a book like this, then I have to move from narratives to kind of facts. Right. And facts are very stubborn things. And it is that, yes, there is a potential, and it's an ascendant potential. But on the ground, it hasn't yet made as much difference as it possibly can.
Yeah.
It will. Now, why governments are afraid of it is because of the power to shape narratives. So now I mapped out what I call the loop, the feedback loop for international media. Now what happens is, if you're a journalist from the AP, you land in Nigeria, you're trying to find out what young people think. Usually just one reporter. If you're blessed, you're two. Yeah? You need to form networks. You need to find out what's the pulse of the nation. You're coming from mostly the West, where social media is where Donna Brazil is at, is where, Reince Previous, everybody is there. So you can really map out at least what the elites are thinking, or you can get perspectives. And so you bring that frame into the African context, and you assume that it's the same thing. And then you have loud voices on social media who you think to yourself, well, I don't have the resources to go to Kebbi or to go here and find out what's happening. How about I talk to this guy who's influential on social media? And that's how usually the narrative is skewed, so that it seems as if the voices on social media on the continent are fully representative of the voices on the ground. Now, sometimes they are, many times they are not. And so the job of a campaign strategist is really to sift out the noise from really the facts. Yeah. And what governments are uncomfortable with is the ability of the loud voices on social media to color the perceptions of those governments to an international audience.
So it's more about the international audience?
It's more about the international audience, to be honest. It's more about that. It's more about
international.
Yes. So for them, their narratives are shaped the way that they're received when they visit international fora, the way that they are perceived when their historical legacies are being mapped out. They're very sensitive as to those things. And so they understand the power of social media to do that. Also, social media is important in building, has been important in building social movements across the continent. Now, those social movements are not necessarily that influential in politics, so to speak, immediately, but they serve the effect of weakening. It's like a drip effect that weakens the legitimacy, drains the resources, drains the attention of the government. So governments are usually thinking, how do we shut down this annoyance and stop it from mushrooming into something that we cannot control? And so that's really the fear. But there is no doubt. So progressively from 2011 to 2015, there's no doubt in Nigeria, in Ghana, that social media became increasingly more powerful in terms of getting out more people to vote. Maybe not enough to tip the elections, but enough to scare people, to scare political leaders, to have them investing more. So even if it doesn't matter as yet, as much as it can in various countries, politicians will be remiss to ignore it because it is going to continue to matter even more in each election cycle.
No, I think that's incredible. You want to come in? Okay. How long? Okay. So I wanted to follow up with something that I think you probably touched on in your book, but I just want to frame. I hadn't got to this bit yet because I did see it there,
right.
In the chapters.
Right.
But I want to frame it in a particular way. We see a lot. It's just something that I've been thinking about for a long time. We see a lot, particularly around elections, when you talked about the idea of the incumbents would often talk about corruption, right? And I'm interested in, just because you get pretty close to these governments and to people in power, how people think about it in a certain way. Because my whole framework for this is how much of, and I remember the rather infamous statement by Goodluck Jonathan, but you put it another way. How much of the problems are corruption versus incompetence? I'm curious to know how you think about it, because you remember that famous...
corruption is not stealing.
Corruption is not stealing.
Stealing is not corruption. Yeah.
Yes, only Nigeria. Yeah. But yeah, I'm curious how you see it, like, because I a lot of the time I think a lot of the problems are people can't do their jobs.
Yes. I mean, I wrote an article for Quad over the weekend where I say in many African
democracies... It was a very good article. By
Thank you. I say in many African democracies we must resist the temptation to attribute malice where simple stupidity will suffice. And I see that a lot. Most times something happens, something that is just a cluster F word and people are trying to find the Machiavellian, trends of how the government. So it's like, still is not corruption. People think, I watched that interview. I watched it a lot. I watched it. Jonathan was trying to make a philosophical point. He was trying to make, he had just read a book or something.
Just read a book.
Yeah, just read a book. Somebody had just done this, and he thought, this is interesting. Yes, that's something. I like that statement, I've spent a day with Jonathan. Debola wasn't lucky enough to do that. But I spent a day with Jonathan on a Sunday. I went to church with him. I had lunch with him, in 2011. And I can imagine that. It's like, yes, that's a good idea. It's not corruption. And that is, and the thought behind that is noble, even useful. And that's what we are referring to, which is sometimes these people are thieves, and there are simple thieving laws to deal with these matters. They don't rise to the level of complexity. And I find that that's a constant theme in dealing with in democracies we've worked in, which is Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and maybe a bit of Liberia, which is that sometimes just people who don't know how to do their jobs. People just don't know how to do their jobs. Even in communication, you see a press release that's issued, and you're just like, no, you can't send that press release out. And then you ask the person to give you what's the thinking behind this press release? And there is no sophistication behind the thinking. It's not a complex process.
I get those press releases.
Yes, it's just that I think, therefore I do. Yeah. No, I saw, therefore I do, or something like that. And that's a more insidious problem for many West African democracies and some of the East African democracies we've been working on than corruption. It's just simple inefficiency. It's an inelegance that comes from a lack of being able to do their jobs. When the Chibok girls happened, I was in Abuja for a while, and people, there was no malice. Jonathan didn't think, oh, I hate the North. Yeah. It was just for the first 3-4 days, people were thinking, is this my enemies? Are these? It's it's Instagram thinking. Is it my haters? And so this thinking, and I heard this from senior special assistants, allowed the terrorists have a 2-day head start over a government that could have prevented the continuous movement if it had stepped in on time. It was just incompetent. It was just incompetent.
Okay, so we have to wrap up. So I'm going to give a few quick fire ones.
Right.
We're just going to wrap up.
Right.
I'm just going to give you a name and you tell me what you think. No, it's really simple, people. And if you don't have any thoughts, we can move on to the next one. Right. John Magufuli in Tanzania. What's your quick thoughts?
Complex. I think that, sometimes I want to praise, I want to praise because relative to other spaces, you see things that give you hope. But ultimately, you don't want to praise too much that the narrative lulls, especially the youth activists or the youth social movement. So I'd say, I keep an eye on that situation in a way that it's suspicious praise, so to speak.
We've just been talking about Paul Kagame.
Oh, I've written extensively about Paul Kagame, and I'm actually working on a book about Rwanda next year and the power of emotions. I think that Kagame is inspiring. But even when I use that word, I worry that he hears it. I wish I could say it without him hearing it. I wish he would only hear the criticism.
I kind of think it ties in with our quick conversation about corruption and versus incompetence.
Right.
It's actually someone who's competent.
Yes.
He's actually competent.
Yes, but
then
there's
something at some things.
Yes, there's something that Moge from Botswana says that the problem is that, unfortunately, these highly competent people, because of the nature of democracy, don't know when welcome is now goodbye. Yes. And that's usually the point at which competence, when you confuse self-interest with national interest, because you've just been there too long, you don't even know the difference. Okay. And so with Kagame, I worry that we are now at the space where competence might begin to turn into something more insidious.
All right, two more. Two more people. Not two more questions. And then Johnson Sirleaf? I know you wrote about her.
I wrote about her recently as well. I think she's formidable. I think that what she's done, again, this is relative. You know, there are people who don't want me to say this, but it's relative. I have to look at what she's done relative to what could have been. And what she's done in keeping that country peaceful, while its democracy has been boisterous. That's something remarkable. So the democracy has been boisterous, people have been on the streets, people have been vocal, and yet there has been peace in the nation. I think that's an impressive accomplishment. Of course, there's the issues of corruption, there's the issues of nepotism. I'm worried by her homophobia, for instance. But on the balance of things, I would say this has been a formidable woman who has kept an impressive peace in that country.
And last one, President Buhari.
Oh God. Oh God. I know I say that in Nigeria, the stench of Buhari follows me around. It is harsh, and I'm harsh on him because he came in with a lot of promise. I mean, I could write a book about Buhari and the failure of promise. I think that he's a massive disappointment. Now, not because I had high expectations. And that's usually a tricky thing because I tell people, again, I say getting Jonathan out of office, punishing a recalcitrant president was more important to me than anything else. But then he went lower than my low expectations of him. And since I have low expectations generally of West Africa's leaders, that's really a low place to be, yeah? And so I think that he's a massive disappointment, and even more so because he doesn't seem to be aware of the scale of the disappointment, you know? And so I think that it behoves every single person who invested hope in his presidency to say that this kind of failure is not acceptable.
All right, Chude.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chude. Thank you very much. I'd like to call on the Executive Director, Religious Freedom and Society in Africa, Project at Yale, Michael Glerup. Thank you.
Thank you. So I noticed many of you in the room are from West Africa or very familiar with Africa. So Bishop Kuka is probably well known to you. He is the Roman Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Sokoto. He did a PhD in political science at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He also was a Rhodes Fellow at St. Anthony's at Oxford and the Edward Mason Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government. He has served as a member of the Nigerians Truth Commission, as a secretary of the Political Reform Conference for Nigeria, and a member of Nigeria's Electoral Reform Committee. He is the founder of the Kuka Center, which is a Nigerian-based policy research center. The center actively promotes conversations between Nigeria's communities of faith, as well as between leaders in faith and public policy. The Kuka Center aspires to become Nigeria's leading institution for the promotion of an active and engaged citizenry by providing support for inclusive dialogue and advocacy issues. He's written a number of books, including Democracy and Civil Society in Nigeria. I've been known Bishop Matthew for at least 7 years now, and I've tried to get him on campus a number of times, and this is the first time we've been able to get him here for a lecture series tomorrow. So we're very excited to have him here. We're glad that Chude wanted him to be here tonight, too. So welcome, Matthew.
Don't mind the way I look. I'm still feeling cold. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. Hello, young lady. How are you?
Nice to meet you, sir.
Thank you. I'm sure that whatever I need to say has already been said. Chude, congratulations, and thank you very much for roping me into all this. I was very happy that you ended up with. Let me perhaps start where you stopped, talking about Buhari. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. One, because I don't know much, but I've always been laughing inside me when I hear people like you and all those who were quite exuberant about Buhari And I kept saying to Nigerians, because I've known Buhari for the better part of 20 years, I can't claim to be close to him, but I worried when I saw the amount of enthusiasm and exuberance, in part because I thought that Nigerians had really not been asking some of the questions that needed to be asked about people who wanted to govern the country. Is this? Okay. I had actually, just ahead of the elections, I'd spoken to President Jonathan, and I said I needed to interview both himself and Buhari. And he said, well, I'll be more than happy to be interviewed by you. And I went to Buhari and I said, look, I'd like to sit down with two of you. Just let's pretend that we're having a presidential debate, the kind of thing that really hardly happen in Nigeria, because very difficult to get any of the candidates to sit down and face one another. And General Buhari surprisingly accepted. He said, are you the one who is going to do it? I said, yes. But maybe less than a week to the time of the interview, I get a call from one of his aides, who is now a minister, and someone I knew. They'd been very, very close. And he said to me, he said, I've actually decided to cancel the interview. I heard you were going to speak to my principal. And I said, yes. He said, well, I've decided to cancel the interview. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, I've decided to cancel the interview because I don't trust you. And I said, why? Because this is, again, somebody we've known one another for well over 30 years, a very fine journalist. And he said, well, you know, my fear is that you may ask one single question, either before, in the middle, or at the end of the interview, that will so destabilize my principal that we could end up losing this election. I know we are coasting to victory. So I dropped the idea, but I also knew that we were somehow heading for a lot of trouble, in part because I wasn't sure that President Buhari, as a candidate then, had been subjected to any rigorous interview. Nobody knew where he stood, and I kept saying to some of my friends that, you know, can any Nigerian tell me whether they had ever seen President Buhari, even in Nigeria, on the pages of a newspaper, say, delivering a lecture somewhere, being at a conference, even being at a social event such as a wedding ceremony or a funeral in Nigeria. But let me, sorry, I think I better stop there, because I think what we sowed is what we are reaping. And we are notorious in Nigeria for progressing backwards, because usually in Nigeria, yesterday is always better than today, including if you push back to Abacha. You'll be surprised to hear what Nigerians will say about Abacha, because they think somehow yesterday was always better. But I just thought I should, you know, since we're talking about elections in Africa, I don't think there's anything that has not been said yet. But what I thought we could start off with was even understanding the grammar of politics. And I had the last bit of what you were saying about Jonathan. And I don't know whether we're not facing the whole dilemma of a lot of what we're trying to say. It's not so much that is lost in translation as the fact that we've gradually succumbed to what came to the fore in 1986, when Babangida said that he didn't want too many professors speaking a lot of what we call in Nigeria long grammar. This was the period of the structural adjustment. And I think it was actually at that point that intellectual curiosity the political elite became quite hostile to intellectual curiosity. And you can track the dissent and the concern for rigor and intellectualism. And of course, by the 90s, a lot of Nigerian intellectuals had fled Nigerian universities and were now, this is why from Albania to Zimbabwe, there's no place now you will not find Nigerian professors. Indeed, it's a measure of the resilience of the country that the universities are still standing and that there are still lecturers. But I think that at that point, the quality of leadership then, it didn't quite decline, but it is that even we ourselves began to, fall for the fallacy of what was his name? What is called the Procrustean bed. You know, the thing about Procrustes, who was this guy who, you know, if you were too short to fit a bed, you had to be stretched to fit the bed. He had a bed. If you were too tall, you were cut to size. So we ended up with a situation in which it's not so much, and I think one of the manifestations of that was Jonathan. You know, that why do you up the game while it is easier for you to speak the market language that everybody understands? So the result then is that Nigerian politicians have never really been too curious about raising the ante as speaking the language that ordinary people understood. And I think that I listened to the debate about Jonathan and him saying that stealing was not corruption and so on. But I think that at a philosophical level, you have to answer the question of how and why is it that among bishops, among priests, among intellectuals in Nigeria, we've not been able to generate enough sense of moral revulsion against corruption in a much more serious manner. And that Jonathan was actually, in the final analysis, amplifying what is popular to all of us, which is that corruption is the only thing that works. Now, how you walk through that in an environment that is so barren of infrastructure, in an environment where the things that the rest of the world has come to take for granted are just totally absent. What you then find in corruption is that it is the crutch that the cripple needs to be able to get from point A to point B. Now, is that an acceptance? It isn't. But it is also, I think it helps us to pay attention to the kind of expectations that we have in terms of how people deal with the issues of politics. I'm sure you may have read Chinua Achebe's little book, Girls at War, in which he tells the story of the dilemma of a Nigerian voter who is bonded to his political party, so to say, under oath that he must deliver. But then the opposition party pays him a bit of money on the eve of the election. And he goes to the polling booth and has this moral crisis. I have an obligation to vote for my party. But I also have, even there is honor among thieves. I mean, I've collected money from this guy. Will I not? So he folds his ballot paper into 2 equal parts, cuts it into 2, and then says, I have satisfied both. And of course, the other thing is that perhaps, as we say in Nigeria, I hear a lot of talk about outcomes and how we need to improve the system. Yes, it is true. But I think where we are at now in Africa, many parts of Africa, is really what the French writer who talks about African politics being politics of the belly, that things are so skewed in a way that if you ask Nigerians now, including the intellectuals, what is likely to happen in 2019, nobody knows. If Buhari decides to run, what are the consequences? I don't know. Who is out there in the horizon that might be able to withstand Buhari? Nobody knows. That means that we're in total agreement that you have to have the money and you have to have the ability to organize. How religion intersects with region and ethnicity, these are the ingredients of, and what you really do with power. I'll end in a minute. I remember being at a lecture when I had to speak to the Nigerian Bar Association, and I said something to the effect, President Jonathan was there, and I said, to be president of Nigeria, the presidency Nigeria is the most powerful position anywhere in the world. And I saw how Jonathan smiled. But then the next sentence I made was, which president anywhere in the world can from his bedroom or his toilet or his bathroom just simply issue out a check of $5 million or $10 million to you without talking to anybody, and you can collect the check through the window and it's good to go to the bank. It just doesn't happen. And I think that once you understand that being a president of Nigeria is presiding over a distribution agency, it comes with a lot of consequences. So when we think about whether the elections will be free and whether they will be fair, and whether free and fair elections necessarily guarantee the kind of outcomes that we expect, I think these are the issues for intellectual discussion. But then we still remember what Kamuzu Banda said. When they said to him, the opposition are coming back to contest election, he said, well, bring them home. I'll try them and I'll give them a fair trial and hang them. I think because politics is still largely a zero-sum game, I think we just have to learn to cope with how to manage the fallout. But let me thank you very much and congratulate you for, I hope I'll be able to read the book. But see you at the ballot box. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bishop Kuka. Debola? At this point, I'd like to thank each and every one of us, and I'll call Debola to probably say one thing, or I don't know, just one phrase, so we can wrap up. Oh, 18 on 11th, okay. Oh. Yeah.
I'm just here for the pictures. You know, last week I gave a speech in Chicago for President Barack Obama. And so since then I said that I would only give speeches where presidents are seated. And that's why I decided not to speak tonight. So, you know, yeah, but thank you all for coming. And I think that I have enjoyed, you know, for once in a long time, sitting on the other side and just listening and learning again, you know. Like I said last week, like my mentor, Dr. Obi Ezekwesili, says all the time, like my partner says, at the end of the day, you know, we all here are citizens of one country or the other. We belong to one nation or the other. And what is most important is that after casting that vote, after reading about how to win the elections in Africa, after being part of whatever electoral process, what do we do next? It is to continually demand of those we have contracted to supply us governance. And that is the office of the citizen, the highest office in any land. The book is going to be globally released on the 11th of November. So we're releasing, you know, globally all at the same time. So if you wish to purchase the book, if you go to solar.co, solar, SOLAR.co, you can actually make payments and pre-order the book. But it will be on Amazon by the 11th of November, and I'm sure that we're also going to have it in stores on the Yale campus by the 11th of November. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Oh, and of course, thank you to the Africa Council, the Yale Council on African Studies, Eddie Mandri, Nora, Frankie, amazing woman. Yes. Thank you. Round of applause, Frankie. Amazing woman.
Frankie, Nadira, Malaika, Resla, for making this event a huge success.
Yes, of course, our panelists, you know, all of them, amazing insight, and thank you for the work you're doing, amazing work. Chris, who flew in from Washington to be part of this, you know, we worked together in Ghana, amazing guy, thank you so much. Father Kuka, thank you for honoring us, you know, we're always grateful for your presence. All our friends who've come from far and near, Remy, my sister from New York, who's flown in, Sheyi, Yinka, Mercy, you know, everyone. Kenneth, you know, one of the nominees of our awards, the Future Awards, who came in from Harvard as well. Thank you all. Mrs. Mogalu, you know, who came in from DC for this as well. My friend Joe, who came in from Chicago. Thank you, all of you, thank you. The guys from Yale, thank you for coming all the way from Yale to also be here. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Yes, thank you, Mercy.